Days of Glory series by Victus, a game by Frederick Bay. Rules, Chapter 3, Strategic Initiative. During the Strategic Initiative phase, that's phase B of the turn sequence, each player rolls 1d10 and adds the die roll modifier of his Commander-in-Chief. The one designated for this in the scenario instructions if that side has more than one Commander-in-Chief. The player with the higher total gains the initiative for that turn. If the totals are equal, neither player has the strategic initiative and all the activation markers are placed in the cup. The player with the strategic initiative may choose one activation marker belonging to one of his formations with which to begin the turn by activating it before all the others. Do not place this activation marker in the cup. This formation's status may be either received orders or no orders. Okay. The player may also decide not to choose a formation and thus to forego using his advantage. In this case, the activation phase begins with the random draw of an activation marker, just as it does in the case of ties on the modified die roll. Chapter 4, Movement Allowance. So we have normal movement. Each unit has a movement allowance expressed in movement points indicated on the counter. This number represents the maximum number of movement points which the unit may expend during one activation phase when it has received orders. Then we have reduced movement. A unit having no orders has its movement allowance divided by 2 fractions rounded up. So in an example, if a unit has a movement allowance of 7 movement points and it has no orders, it will move with a reduced allowance of 4 movement points. That's 7 divided by 2, 3.5 fractions rounded up to 4. Forced march. A forced march permits doubling of a unit's movement allowance. Only a unit which has received orders and is neither disordered nor routed may make a forced march, and then only on condition that it does not start or move within 5 hexes of an enemy unit. If the unit wishes to approach within 5 hexes or less of the enemy, it must do so during normal movement. A unit may use only one type of movement during an activation. It is not possible to begin movement by a forced march and finish in normal mode, or the reverse. Okay. One type of movement during an activation. Well, yeah. That's funny. I don't get why that specification is in there. Okay, one type of movement. A unit moving by forced march may neither enter nor pass through a hex containing a friendly unit. That's interesting. But I understand that's it has to do with, I'm guessing it has to do with formations and the ability for formations to pass through each other. Basically, I think units have to slow way down to do that, thus precluding the idea of moving by forced march. Units in a stack may leave the stack, but may not join it during the forced march. This also applies to stacks of reinforcements. Again, I'm not sure why they're specifying that. You're not joining. All right. Then we have forming square. Forming square is part of movement. Forming square is only allowed in clear terrain and is only for infantry and artillery, units which are neither disordered nor routed. Forming square or leaving square is allowed while in an enemy zone of control. A unit may form square during its activation. You place a square marker on it, so there's a separate chit to indicate square formation, only if it does not move. Forming square costs a unit's entire movement allowance, whether it has received orders or has no orders. 2 units may form square in the same hex only if they are already present in that hex at the moment of their activation. An artillery unit may not form square unless it is stacked at the time of its activation with an infantry unit, which is also forming square. Note, it is thus impossible for any unit, infantry or artillery, to join a square that is already in place. As long as it is in square, a unit may not move. A unit is allowed to leave square during its activation at a cost of 2 movement points. The unit may then be faced freely and may move using its remaining movement points. A unit in square may not engage in shock or counter shock. That's interesting. There's something called counter shock. Interesting. But it may defend normally when it is the target of shock or charge. See the chart, die roll modifiers for shock or charge for the bonus or penalty to apply when resolving the combat. If a unit in square becomes disordered or has to recoil as a result of combat, it immediately leaves square, remove the square marker. If an infantry unit which is part of a stack of units in square becomes disordered, the entire stack leaves square. A hex may never contain one infantry unit which is in square and another which is not. Forming square affects the unit's facing and zone of control. Movement and terrain. A unit expends movement points each time it moves. The cost of movement points for each hex depends on the type of unit and the type of terrain. See the terrain table. Changing facing is not movement, and units do not expend movements for it. Changing facing, okay. That's a separate rules section. Roads and trails. A unit using a road or trail benefits from its reduced movement cost indicated on the terrain table if the unit enters a road or trail hex by way of another hex containing the same road or trail. Otherwise, it expends the normal cost of terrain in that hex. A unit may not use road or trail movement to place itself adjacent to an enemy unit. It must pay the normal cost for the last hex, including the cost of the hex side. Exception. Roads and trails allow cavalry units to cross steep slopes, and they allow artillery units to cross slopes and steep slopes. The NA on the terrain effects table is ignored, and an extra 2 points are added to the movement cost. Interesting. Impassable terrain. Certain hexes and hex sides are impassable. Units may not enter these hexes or traverse these hex sides unless they are crossed by a road, trail, or a bridge. Movement restrictions. So we have general restrictions. A moving unit must trace on the map a continuous path of adjacent hexes from one to the next while paying the cost and movement points for each hex it enters. Units move independently of each other, and one unit's movement must be completed before movement of another begins. So we have individual unit movement. Oh, exception. Okay, there is a stack exception. If all units in a stack are of the same type, so that would be infantry, cavalry, or artillery, and performs the same move, the player may move the entire stack together. And then it says while paying the cost for movement points for each hex it enters. I'm pretty sure that includes hex sides as well. The facing of a unit has no effect on the cost of its movement. A unit must always have enough movement points left to pay the cost of the hex it wishes to enter. If it does not have enough movement points left, it cannot enter the hex. Movement points may not be accumulated from one activation phase to another. Combat units and commanders-in-chief may not leave the map voluntarily except as a result of route movement or due to specific scenario instructions. Now we have movement of artillery. Artillery units, there's a special movement reduced marker, or chit marker, I guess. Artillery units have received orders. Artillery units that have received orders may move if they have fired at the beginning of the activation phase. Artillery fire is performed before any other action. See the sequence of play, but their movement allowance is halved. Place a fire movement reduced marker on the unit as a reminder. This marker applies only to the current activation and not to the entire turn. Remove the marker at the end of the activation. That's important to remember, because I'm not sure. I don't remember seeing that on the sequence of play. Is that there? No, I didn't see that. No. I don't see it in the sequence of play, so remember that. On the other hand, an artillery unit having no orders cannot move after firing. Movement through friendly units. Entering a hex occupied by one or more friendly units with the intention of passing through it costs 1 extra movement point. Entering such a hex with the intention of stopping in the hex requires no extra cost. Exceptions. A unit using forced march may not enter a hex containing a friendly unit, nor may it pass through such a hex. No unit may enter or pass through a hex containing a friendly unit already in square. All right, those are the exceptions. So those are exceptions to movement through friendly units in general. Yeah. All right. Stacking and reinforcements. Stacking and reinforcements. All right.